actually, when I started this book, very much in this building. I came about 2.5 years ago to see Tim and said, look, I'm thinking of writing about Tony Blair, what do you think? And he said, no, that's a really good idea. And I thought, well, that's it then. And he did say, but if you do it, will you launch it at CPS? So it's been 2.5 years, but there we are, we're here. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it, the speech, because it is really such a fascinating and complicated story that if I speak without notes or anything like that, you'll get a gist of it. But I really have got a lot to say, but I'll keep it down to 10 minutes. So let me explain to you this man who I've found absolutely fascinating, and I do think this time, unlike Richard Branson, who's so far got away with it, I think Tony Blair will suffer the torpedo. So in May '97, Tony Blair was supremely popular. Britons wanted change. His charming personality and promise to be purer than pure, whiter than white, was a relief from a fractious, sleazy Tory regime. Now, nearly 20 years later, we want to understand what went wrong. How come that virtuous character is a derided carpetbagger? Were we all fooled at the outset by a brilliant actor, or did an honest hero fall victim to the temptations of power? Did he embark on government in bad faith, or, infected by vanity and uncertain values, did he lose his way? One truth about Blair was highlighted in 2000. The Labour Party's conference magazine that year described Blair's favourite food as fish and chips, which he bought as a takeaway from his local chippy. But as William Hague pointed out, on the same date, Blair told the Islington cookbook that his preferred meal was fresh fettuccine garnished with olive oil, sun-dried tomatoes and capers. Now, New Labour's skill was to discover what the electorate wanted and promise it. The truth depended on the audience. Moving from PR to substance was always a challenge for Blair. The question is, who was the real Tony Blair? For a start, the mistake made by the electorate was thinking that Blair arrived in Downing Street with a programme for government. He didn't. Despite all his promises, he had devoted his energy to winning the election and ignored what would follow victory. But after a decade in power, he complained that when he pulled the levers and nothing happened, it was the civil servants' incompetence. In turn, they blamed his ignorance about the skills of management and his ignorance of history. For Blair, a man blessed with intelligence and remarkable skills of communication, was also frighteningly uneducated. Instead of crunching detail, Blair prided himself about relying on instinct and belief. "I only know what I believe in," he once said, revealing his misunderstanding of governance and so much more. And so in the brief moments I have, we get to the heart of the problem. Blair's inheritance in '97 was a growing economy, control over immigration, a widespread trust of Britain's robust institutions, but undoubtedly an underfunded NHS and education system. Over the previous 18 years, the Tories had nevertheless developed, by trial and error, schemes to improve the NHS and education, to defeat what Blair himself would later call the forces of conservatism within those professions. By giving parents, the Tories had decided, and patients choice and encouraging competition among schools and hospitals, they thought they'd found the way finally to improve state institutions. Blair abolished immediately those delicate beginnings. He introduced targets, performance indicators, and on the other side, cheating on the back of vast expenditure. Of course, there were substantial improvements in the NHS over that decade, but not commensurate with a 300% increase in the budget. Billions were poured into the NHS and productivity declined. Doctors and nurses got huge pay increases, but worked less hours. Unlike Thatcher, Blair was never heard to say, "I want my money well spent." By 2001, however, Blair realised the Tories had been right, and he tried to reintroduce choice and competition into the NHS. The result was expensive and chaotic and a failure. In education, it was the same. The Tories' numerous legacy hours for primary school children by '97 were genuinely improving standards. Labour kept the headlines, but imposed on teachers targets and told them how to teach. As a result, 11-year-olds were taught how to pass tests, but were denied knowledge and understanding. 9 years later, last January, the OECD reported that English undergraduates were classified in literacy and numeracy as the worst out of 23 developed nations. That damnation was a direct result of the strategies, targets and tests introduced by Blair and his man Michael Barber, the delivery unit, after '97. But to be fair, Blair did recognise the problem he created. To repair the damage to education, he returned to the Tory system of choice and competition, but it was too late. He had abolished over 1,000 grant-maintained schools. Of course, he sent two of his children, to one of those schools, and replaced them with 68 academies, whose results were damned by Ofsted. Today, at least 30% of children are still leaving school without basic skills. And pertinently, under Blair, education of the poorest children actually declined. And social mobility, as Alan Milburn himself discovered, got worse under Tony Blair. Yet you would not have known that truth from the Blairite spin. Statistics were massaged and exam results inflated. The same deception concealed the government's immigration policy. Blair never told the electorate that he'd approved the entry of every year 500,000 immigrants. Those who dared to protest were called racist. The unchallengeable proof of all that dishonesty are the 200 civil servants, Labour politicians and military officers I interviewed for this book. Nothing was more revealing about Blair, however, than their accounts about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 wars launched on the basis of lies. How could a mature democracy like Britain commit itself to fight those 2 wars on a false prospectus? No one predicted in '97 Blair's interest in war. After all, he even avoided service in the cadet force at school. Yet he turned Britain into a global troubleshooter, what he called a force for good. Convinced that he could rid the world of tyrants, he never considered the consequences behind the headlines. The result by now is an undermanned, ill-equipped, underfunded and fatally misguided British army, which had been dispatched to fight the biggest wars since Korea, based on faulty intelligence and misjudged purposes, and returning humiliated from both conflicts. That occurred because Blair excluded from his office experts who would be critical. He acted on instinct rather than knowledge, and he acted in a conspiratorial secrecy because he knew his military ambitions in Iraq especially were illegal. From my research, Tony Blair was not Bush's poodle. Ever since he joined Clinton in bombing Iraq in '98, he had wanted to topple Saddam. He had always supported regime change. That intensified after 9/11. Blair's problem was that an unprovoked war to topple Saddam was illegal under British law. So having secretly settled on that policy 16 months before Iraq was invaded, he contrived a smokescreen to justify the invasion, namely Iraq's supposed possessions of WMDs in defiance of the UN. Let's be clear about those 16 months. Blair told the British people that Iraq's WMDs posed a fatal threat forbidden by the UN, but his real intention was always regime change. Whitehall's traditional machinery of government would have stopped that chicanery, but Blair's sofa government had dismantled the safeguard to halt his ambitions. Let's also be clear about something else. Iraq was not an aberration. Misgovernment and deception were New Labour's tools of trade for health, education, immigration, and so much more. The concealment to lead the country into war was business as usual. To Blair's good fortune, Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, confirmed that Saddam did possess WMDs. Dearlove's sources were fabricators and fantasists. The safeguard against those mistakes should have been John Scarlett, the chairman of the JIC. At first, Scarlett told Blair that MI6's intelligence about WMDs was sporadic and patchy. But when Scarlett's dodgy dossier was published in September '02, that embarrassing honesty was omitted. With Scarlett's support, Blair assured the country that the intelligence about WMDs was, in his words, extensive, detailed, and authoritative. How and why did Blair make that false statement? And why did no one stop him? I argue that Blair had fundamentally damaged the independence and quality of Britain's civil service, and the consequences remain to this day. Until July '02, 7 months after 9/11, Blair's intention to join Bush's invasion was known to very few in Downing Street. Those deliberately excluded by Blair were the Cabinet Secretary, the Defence Chiefs, and even the Permanent Secretary of the Defence Ministry. To go to war without the advice of the MOD's most senior official was unprecedented. Even in July '02, Admiral Mike Boyce, the Chief of the Defence Staff, was told that no decision had been taken. Boyce warned Blair about the dangers of war. From that moment, he was regarded with suspicion. He told truth unto power. On the eve of war, Blair tried to fire Boyce. In the aftermath, General Mike Walker, Boyce's successor, even threatened to resign because Blair refused to provide the money to save the British Army from humiliation in southern Iraq. To my mind, however, the Afghan war is even more shocking. Blair had refused to learn any lessons from Iraq. He sent the army to Helmand for what he called peaceful nation building. In the name of Britain, he fought those wars to remove peaceful nation building. And yet, what happened was that once again, however, the intelligence was wrong, the army was undermanned, underfunded, ill-equipped, and misled. But this time, 453 people died, hundreds were maimed, and it cost Britain £38 billion for nothing. And for worse, the damage to Britain's military was compounded. In my view, the Army's current plight mirrors that of Britain's education institutions, the NHS, the judiciary, the city and parliament. So many British values have been tarnished by Blair, not at least the absence of any shame in public life. So in conclusion, Blair's decade did make a difference, but it was the wrong difference. He tapped the right sentiments, but betrayed the people's trust. Blairism was not an ideology, nor a set of principles. It was a concoction of intentions, dressed up in verbless prose, usually mentioning the word modernization. But it was modernization without meaning. Unlike Thatcherism, today there's no Blairism. In the name of Britain, he fought wars to remove dictators, but now profits from serving dictators. Did Blair suddenly change after leaving Downing Street, or was he always a charlatan who concealed his true character through spin? In my opinion, he was an uneducated opportunist, whose decade was a missed opportunity, and the tragedy is a blight on Britain for the rest of our lives. Thank you very much.
Tom is going to take a few questions now. Do you think we could let in, before we do the could we let in, there's a big crowd outside the door. Could we, all of you out there, could you come in, please? Let's just give them a chance. Come on in.
Yeah.
Come in all. Excellent. Now, I saw some hands up. Who? Please, go ahead. Professor.
Your book's very valuable, but will anybody listen? Do we now know, thanks to Blair, that we have a system which any charlatan can come along and make use of in the way that Blair has?
Well, I think the point is I do hope that, I expect that David Cameron has more integrity than Blair. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But what I find is, in my forays into Whitehall, that it has lost the self-confidence and the quality of people to rebuild the system that was there before. And there's a sort of a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of history, and it'll need a different permanent cabinet secretary, I think, and a different prime minister to say we must now rebuild what we had before, and that demands someone with knowledge, with courage, with the tenacity of actually believes in rebuilding the system of government we had. And so I think we're gloomy about that, but it depends on the prime minister in the end, and that's the question.
There's lots of hands up here. Please go ahead.
History will be very, very unkind to Tony Blair. He will undoubtedly be judged as one of the worst, if not the worst, British Prime Minister of the last century. But the fact remains he did win 3 general elections in a row. How do you explain the fact that he could win these majorities, given the record you've described?
Because he had a very weak opposition. The Tory party had very poor leadership, and it was as simple as that. Even in 2005, the Tory party couldn't decide its policies, couldn't decide on its leader, and it failed actually to get a winning slogan. And so it was by default. And so in 97, undoubtedly, he won of the landslide because he deserved it. In 2001, the Tories couldn't put up a fight. But 2005, he should never have lost, especially by that number of votes, and that was the Tory failure. And that in the end, what it is, it's a lesson for parties in opposition that unless you, right from the beginning, begin to think about what your election campaign is going to be about, what you stand for, you're destined to lose, which is what we're now watching Mr. Corbyn wonderfully do.
Over here in the
Yes,
corner.
John Norton, who was Mo Murdom's second husband, who was a good friend of mine, told me that he believed that Blair started off as a Christian Democrat. Do you get any of that feeling from your
Well, there is a story in the book about Michael Howard tells that when Blair arrived in the Commons in '83, he invited Sherry and Tony for dinner because he couldn't understand what he was doing in the Labour Party. And once he listened to Sherry, he knew why.
Coming over here.
Tom, did you interview Mr. Blair?
No,
Did you ask him?
I sent him a brief email.
And what was his reply?
I didn't get one.
Coming here.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead, please.
In light of what you've just said, would you say he has a case to answer in the International Court in Hague?
No, because I think the war was legal in the sense that it was approved by Parliament, and I think that would be a terrible mistake to go that path. I mean, in the end, the country voted for it. I believed it. I could not believe that the Prime Minister would not tell the truth about WMDs. And what we faced is a failure of the system. So I think we've got to look to the civil servants and everybody else who actually allowed this to happen. But in the end, the Prime Minister had the support of Parliament. I know.
No, keep going. Yes, coming there. Coming to you in a minute.
Tony Blair sent the British Army into Sierra Leone. I'm here with a friend of mine from Sierra Leone. The very fact that that was relatively successful, and there wasn't much loss of life, particularly with respect to the British Armed Forces, do you think that encouraged Tony Blair to commit our forces to a whole host of other operations?
Absolutely. I described that very carefully in the book. I mean, the truth is that Sierra Leone was an huge 5,000 British troops, a whole naval force, against a gang of drug dealers. And in Kosovo, in the end, it was a drive-in by the army, and that he got the wrong impression. But this is what I mean about the lack of education. Blair's great weakness was not that he wasn't intelligent, but that he hadn't read anything. And I don't think he's here today, but the book starts with an argument with Robin Butler at the very beginning, when Robin tries very hard to persuade the Prime Minister to understand how government works, and the Prime Minister wasn't interested, and then suffered for 10 years because of that.
Lord Guthrie is here.
Well, I was there at the beginning when he came in, and I tell you that it was quite a relief to get a new Prime Minister after John Major, who was a much more decent man, and the cabinet were better. But poor old John Major knew that the Conservatives were going to lose. Everybody knew they were going to lose, and it made them very bitchy amongst each other. And therefore, I find it extremely difficult to get John Major to make a decision. And therefore, the awful thing was that when Blair came, he didn't, in the early days, have a difficult cabinet, and therefore he tended to be easier for me to deal with. Now, I think they were horrible to John Major, you know.
They were.
Horrible to him. And I needed somebody. And therefore, I slightly applauded the Chicago speech he made, which was, if good men do nothing, evil prospers. Now, we all know that doesn't actually always work. But Blair, my great contribution to the British was to keep Blair out of wars. He wanted to go to Angola. He wanted to go to the Congo, neither of which were anything to do with us. But he felt that, you know, he had the wind behind him, and that was it. Your book is absolutely right, however. And I like to think that as soon as I stopped being Chief of Defence Staff, things fell apart.
I forgot to put that line in. I do.
I'm looking forward to read your book, because I agree with all you say, but I've had at least one person ringing up complaining about me.
Who was that?
What no, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you, Lord Levy, who doesn't matter at all. And as far as this discussion is concerned, ignore what I say.
Peter.
Thank you. I've often wondered, and I'd love to hear from you, to what extent did Blair lean on, take advice from, was influenced by two people in particular, Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell?
Well, I can answer that right in this way here. I started my journalistic career in 1969 on the train with Willy Brandt when he was campaigning to be Chancellor. And every night I'd sit with Brandt and watched him with his cronies. They were the chauffeur and the protection, and they played a card game called Scat. And from that moment on, I learned that you judge a politician by the company he keeps. And you must judge Blair by Mandelson and Campbell. Nothing else suffices. I mean, that would be the easiest way to summarize the book. Everything went wrong.
Yeah.
But why did he rely on a man like Campbell? Why could he fire Mandelson to keep Campbell? It's because without Campbell, he couldn't operate.
Yeah.
He needed Campbell to lie so he could appear as the sweet guy. And in the end, it turns it back to the one thing, that Blair was a brilliant actor.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant performer. He could work a room, he could charm the socks off anybody. And his real problem was that when the charm no longer worked, he was lost. And when Campbell had to leave, he was lost, because he didn't have the discipline. I mean, someone told me yesterday, a man who worked for the MI6, that he once came to brief the Prime Minister, who was with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and he had his feet up on the table in the den, which was an extraordinary insult to the visiting Arab. And Campbell walked in and literally pushed the legs off the desk. That tells you all you need to know.
Could I say one thing about Campbell, though? He saved one occasionally. I remember a time when a flunky carrying a sort of salver with a message from me came into the cabinet room, and the message said, SAS, kill free Serbian warlords. Blair says to me, what's this message about? And I said, well, nothing important. And then I had to tell him, pandemonium. Did we try to arrest them? Were we given a fair chance? Who shot first? I haven't a clue. This is it. Whereupon Campbell stands up and says, we will turn this to our advantage. SAS kill free evil men. And the thing was, they were evil. But I had this terrible thing afterwards. But the two people who really supported this violence were from the left. Robin Cook, Blair Short pinned me to the wall and kissed me and said, we must do more of this.
Coming there.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Tom, I'm looking forward to read the book very much, obviously, like everybody in this room. But rather interesting, nobody has asked a question about the man who brought him down. After all, not only was he the worst Prime Minister in both centuries, but he was also had the worst Chancellor in both centuries, which was quite an achievement, and who in turn went on to be the worst Prime Minister even than the worst. So that was another achievement. So what was the relationship between his
Well,
his
I mean,
fellow
I did write a book about
leader?
it. I wonder, have you got it on your shelf?
It's a very good
Well, thank you. The point about Blair is that the lack of education came with somewhat of a lack of courage. If you don't read history and discover and understand how Macmillan got rid of his opponents, or how Thatcher corralled her critics and got rid of them, you don't know how to do it when it comes to you. And so he actually feared that Brown, who of course he had a good relationship in the sense of they were terrible twins together and they modernised Labour together, that he feared that Brown on the backbenches, with his support in the party and the support of the trade unions, could make his life intolerable. And he should have had the courage in 2001 to fire him and say, try it. And the thing is, that all bullies like Brown really are cowards. And that he would have found within a couple of weeks that Brown would have been muted. And he made a terrible, terrible mistake. And that mistake was compounded because he had no control over spending. And as you'll see in the book, Brown continuously sabotages Blair at each time he wants to do something good, like, for example, foundation hospitals. And I spent a lot of time with Milburn. And the point about foundation, the way they got to foundation hospitals in 2002, and if I could just explain this, because I do think it's critical to understanding the failure of Blair. he abolished completely the whole of choice competition the Tories had worked out with the internal market in '97, put in this ridiculous man, Frank Dobson, health minister, who told the civil service to go back to Aneurin Bevan's ideas in '48. And of course there was an immediate crisis in the health system. So Milburn finally gets the idea with Simon Stevens, the current head of the NHS, they've got to go back to choice in competition, which is Foundation Hospitals. Brown, only on the basis that he had everything that Blair suggested he would oppose, sabotaged it. Now, instead of Blair sticking up for Milburn, he sided with Brown. And there were two consequences. One is the health service went into complete chaos, a complete mismanagement, and when Patricia Hewitt came in, it was a disaster, which is a fantastically interesting story about the decline of Britain in that sense. But more importantly, he lost a potential successor. And Blair's narcissism, and I use that word very carefully, was the ruination of any chance of Blairism. But because he didn't nurture a successor, Milburn or Charles Clarke or whatever, he then lost out completely. He couldn't fight Brown, and he couldn't leave a legacy for the party. So now you've got Corbyn. And sorry, I mean, I wasn't going to use the word narcissism in the book, but I went to Israel, and Shimon Peres said, of course, when I met Blair, I told him that every politician had to be a narcissist and had to be paranoid, not one or the other, but two at the same time. And so I was justified, I thought, in using that word. But I think that's in the end the downfall of the man.
I think you had a question.
Yes, just looking ahead, Blair's let it be known he wants to be active in the Brexit campaign for staying in the European Union. How do you think that would pan out and what impact it would have?
I think they'll do their best to keep him out. In fact, the Leavers should actually recruit him. I think that's the idea.
Let's take a last question.
If we talked about torpedoes earlier, is Chilcot going to be a torpedo? What's your prediction for Chilcot?
I just don't know. I mean, the problem with Chilcot was, and this is the tragedy of the whole thing, it was set up as a secret inquiry by Gus O'Donnell because there was demand for an inquiry into Iraq once the British pulled out. And he appointed Chilcot because he'd served with Robin Butler and therefore was a safe pair of hands, they felt. And then appointed Margaret Aldred, who had run the Iraq and Afghan wars, that was another safe pair of hands. And it was to actually meet in private and report within a year with a whitewash. Once it started, all the hearings were put into public, and it became a problem. These people appointed were not suitable and not qualified to actually ask the lawyer-type questions to get proper answers. And I've watched a hell of a lot of Chilcot, and it really is a very, very sad experience of missed opportunities and bad questioning. So I think, cutting the long story short, now I think they've changed from what had originally been a historic investigation into a proper investigation. But you've got to look at the history of inquiries, whether it's Saville or whether it's the Janet Smith inquiry into the BBC, or whether it's the Widgery inquiry, whatever it was, into Hillsborough thing. Judges and lawyers on the whole, civil servants, don't like coming down hard. Look at the Denning inquiry. They always avoid the honest, harsh truth. So I fear that Chilcot will be the same. He'll equivocate.
Tim, the director, wants to ask a question.
Well, just to say thank you very much to Tom, but one particular question was actually somebody asked me earlier and I didn't know the answer, so I'd ask you. Tony Blair in Britain, his reputation, as you say, is shot, but in the rest of the world, in America, the Middle East, in some parts of the Middle East, and some parts of the world are very much the opposite.
Well, yes, exactly. And I think what is really, in America, undoubtedly because his support for the Iraq war, and he has such charm, and he's articulate, and that counts for a lot in America, especially in Washington. But I think you'll see from the book, his activities since he left office are really quite reprehensible. I mean, here's a man who literally takes money from the worst dictators, and more than that, poses as a man giving charity under the Faith Foundation or offering governance because he says the delivery unit was so successful, but forgets to tell them that when it closed after 4 years, it was closed because they couldn't find a successor because it had been a failure in 2005. And it is the cheek he's got, but it works. Whether it lasts is another question.
According to the Articles of Association of the Centre for Policy Studies, recently written, the chairman gets to ask the final question. So could I put this to the author? So suppose I put the case this way around, that you can know everything you need to know about British politics, everything, in 2 sentences. Conservatives are efficient but cruel. Labour is caring but incompetent. And there was a time, apparently, when observing the truth of that statement, you may say, or many may say, that the New Labour people, Tony Blair particularly, made a completely cold, totally rational, ice-cold calculation, which is that in order to win elections, we can't have all this incompetence. We have to solve the problem of Labour economic incompetence, which they did. And one view would be that that was a cynical act, driven by nothing but the prospects of winning elections. Another view would be, which I put to you, that the third way, by Tony Giddens, did point them in a direction in which they thought they could combine, he thought he could combine the merit of capitalism, in terms of economic competence, and the caring of socialism. So here you could have every schoolboy's dream, compassion and competition, freedom and fairness. That, in other words, what I'm putting to you is that there was somewhere in Tony Blair some belief that this was a real advance that he could bring British people. You didn't have to choose between the perils of socialist incompetence and the cruelty of capitalism. You see what I'm saying?
I do, and I think what you're doing is you're falling into the trap of believing New Labour. And this is the first page of the real history in this book, because what you're repeating and what you're explaining is the genius of their propaganda. But the reality of what actually happened was the exact opposite. I mean, you appoint Frank Dobson, if you appoint Frank Field and Harriet Harman to reform welfare, if you appoint Gordon Brown to run the economy, and all he does is tax and spend and drives us into the ruin of 2008, then you've got the truth of what happened. It was phenomenally incompetent and in the end phenomenally uncaring, because it followed blueprints which didn't work, like this lunatic called Michael Barber at the delivery unit. And so what I really think is the strength of this book, and it was for me a revelation, believe me, I did not come into this thinking I would discover what I just heard from all these 200 people I interviewed. It was quite a surprise, because I believed that he had done a brilliant job, because that's what he told me. But I think you've got to now say that the truth is the exact opposite. Black is white.
Well, isn't it wonderful, everyone, to hear a speaker at the Centre for Policy Studies who says how it really is. It's a great honour to have been able to be part of it.
And buy the book.